Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is yet another installment of the Never Wars. It's been a long time since I've done a video in this series, and I decided to resurrect it from the dead because I was given a request by Night of Snake to do a video about unmade films. And so, what I decided to do is resurrect this series and focus on a particular genre and hopefully turn this into a long running series again. Because I really like this idea of narrowing it down to me just discussing my thoughts on various different unmade film projects from different genres and subgenres of film. So, big shout out goes to Night of Snake for inspiring me to bring this series back. And as you can see, the topic for this installment is comic book films. I'm going to break things up by um, the brand, by the particular comic book company or studio. So I'm gonna start out with like indie comics and then go from there and discuss Marvel and DC comic book film projects. And maybe even some manga. And speaking of manga, I'm actually going to start with that. I do remember reading some articles or some things about another Bio Booster Armor Guyver film or a Guyver 3. And honestly, wish we got either one. I wish we got a Guyver 3 starring David Hayter and from the same people who did Dark Hero. I mean, that film didn't even cost $1 million. It cost less than $1 million to make. So it's not like it was a film that cost a lot to finance and to produce. So they could have made another film or even another one after that, considering the fact that they didn't really spend a whole lot on Guyver 2. So I would have loved to have seen more Guyver movies. That would have been really cool. But I also would love to see another Guyver film from a major studio with a pretty significant budget behind it because I think that could be really awesome. I still think that has some serious potential to be a sleeper hit when it comes to a theatrical release if it's done right and done well. But it just doesn't seem like a lot of studios nowadays are interested. Maybe they're not even that aware of the property. It just seems like one of those things that Buyer Booster Armor MacGyver, other than maybe rumors of another anime series, it just seems like something that has just become pretty obscure. And it's always been not necessarily in the mainstream, but I think it's a really unique and fun and cool enough concept. And I think Guyver in particular is close enough to Marvel and DC and a lot of these other comic book superheroes that I think with the right amount of marketing, the right approach, you could have a new franchise. I genuinely do feel that way. But we're not going to get that. The closest I guess you could say is the Blue Beetle movie, because in a lot of ways Blue Beetle is kind of a ripoff of the Guyver, if you really think about it. Um, but yeah, I wish that we got a Buyer Booster Armor Guyver film with a significant budget and major studio backing, or Guyver 3 and 4. Um, Now, when it comes to the realm of DC, I will get to that a little bit later, as well as Marvel. But now I'm going to focus on an indie comic project that I really wish got produced, and that is Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy 3. Del Toro had always envisioned the Hellboy films to be a trilogy. He always wanted to conclude the series with Hellboy uh, accepting his fate and becoming this harbinger of the apocalypse. but in a way that still enables him to be a hero because he has to do that in order to save us all. And that was always the plan from the beginning. And at least when Del Toro was initially working on Hellboy 2 The Golden Army. I don't know if it was initially the plan from the very beginning with the first Hellboy, but it definitely was something that Del Toro really was passionate about and really wanted to do. But there's a combination of factors that ultimately led to Hellboy 3 never really happening. For one, it was the fact that Hellboy 2 massively underperformed financially for Universal. They had a lot of hopes, and they really did feel that the film would be a bigger hit than it ultimately was. And it was just an unfortunate sense of timing because Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, it debuted, I believe, a week before The Dark Knight came out. So it never really had an opportunity to have a good, let alone a adequate second week in the box office, let alone any longevity after that, because The Dark Knight just steamrolled everything once it came out in theaters. I think Universal should have saw that coming, and I think they should have pushed the film uh, forward or pushed it back to later in the year after The Dark Knight had been in theaters for a long time. And I think if they did that, it would have done considerably better financially. And I think we would have gotten Hellboy 3 because there would have been a financial obligation and there would have been a pretty significant financial reason to back it and to get it produced and made. But because of the fact that Hellboy 2 The Golden Army underperformed considerably due to the fact that Universal put it in a pretty bad spot, Universal didn't see it as something that was financially bankable, so they kept passing on it. And I believe Del Toro, he would say things like, "Well, I wanted to do it, but I don't know if Ron Perlman was up for it. I would talk to him during dinners, and he would seem non-committal. But then there would be other times where I'd talk to him, and he would want to do it." And all of it really had to do with Del Toro getting financial backing for it. And no major studio wanted to financially back it because of the fact that Hellboy 2 didn't do as well in theaters after the surprise hit that was the first film. It's not like Hellboy 2 didn't have a fan base. It's not like Hellboy 2 didn't have people that were wanting to see it. Hellboy 1 was pretty successful and had a lot of good reviews critically, and it had a fair amount of fans, and they were waiting for a sequel. It was just a sense of unfortunate timing, and I just feel that Hellboy 2 The Golden Army on its own is an incredibly underrated sequel, and it deserved better, period. But it just sucks that it's not even really the quality of the film that is the reason why we don't have Hellboy 3. It's not because Hellboy 2 was bad or poorly put together or wasn't executed properly. Hellboy 2 The Golden Army is great, and honestly, I think it's one of the better sequels out there. But it just has to do with the money, and it didn't do well. So it didn't, at least it didn't do nearly as well as the studio would have hoped. So that's why we don't have the conclusion to the Hellboy trilogy. That's why we don't have Hellboy 3, even though Del Toro really wanted to do it. Ron Perlman was willing to do it. Pretty much everybody involved was willing to do it. And instead, we got a ill-conceived reboot. And now we have another reboot slash prequel that's coming out later this year. And it's just, all of this just reminds me of what we could have had. And it honestly, it makes me a bit sad as a fan of Hellboy and as a fan of the first two films that we just couldn't get that Hellboy 3 because of the fact that due to circumstances completely out of the second film's control, it wasn't deemed to be financially bankable anymore as a franchise. So that's why we didn't get the third movie. Because Del Toro couldn't finance it himself either. So yeah, Hellboy 3 is a huge one for me when it comes to unmade comic book films. That's like near the top of the list for me. And when it comes to films that I really, really wish got made. Because I think it would have been great. Because Del Toro would have been involved. It would have had Ron Perlman back as Hellboy and the whole cast and the whole crew. And it would have been definitely something that I feel would definitely be worth the money put into it and then some. But it just wasn't meant to be. Now let's focus on some DC comic projects, shall we? First one off the top of my head is Batman 3. Tim Burton's Batman 3 with Michael Keaton. Tim Burton initially was working on Batman 3 with Keaton. I believe he did have a plan to have the Riddler in there, as well as maybe. I don't know if Hugo Strange was in the works, but there was definitely, or Scarecrow. I know Batman Triumphant, that was the one that had like Scarecrow involved. But I know that Tim Burton initially was, I wouldn't say super enthusiastic about Batman 3, but he was open to the idea. But then a lot of the conversations with the studio and the producers just didn't go that well. I think Burton also had maybe an idea of bringing back Catwoman, Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, and doing something with her. And I just feel that as much as I do have fun with some elements of Batman Forever, the film that Schumacher and Warner Brothers eventually decided to make instead of Burton's third film in the series, I wish that Burton just got the chance to finish his trilogy because of the fact that he did such a good job with the first two. The backlash that Returns got wasn't really his fault. Parents were just triggered and whining and moaning about the subject matter and the intensity of the content of Batman Returns, and the studio overreacted when it comes to different people outside the industry when it comes to merchandising and corporate deals backing out like McDonald's. So there were a lot of things that were completely not even remotely Burton's fault. The studio let Burton do what he wanted. They gave him a blank check and basically told him with Returns, you can do whatever you want. And then when he did what he wanted, as soon as there were sponsors that got all upset about the content and Returns, they backed out. And the studio also looked at the box office returns, which were not as astronomical as Batman, which I don't know why they expected that to be the case anyway. Batman in 1989 itself was an outlier when it comes to the box office. To expect a repeat was ridiculous. It still made a lot of profit and made a lot of money. So it made enough profit and a lot of money to do a third film with Tim Burton at the helm and Michael Keaton returning as Bruce Wayne and Batman. But Warner Brothers just decided not to stick by Burton, and Burton left the project. I think he was also starting to get a little bit tired of Batman. He wanted to go in a different direction, wanted to do something different. What's also sad about Batman 3 is that Keaton initially was open to remaining as a part of the film. He actually met with Joe Schumacher. He actually was in talks with Warner Brothers to return to reprise his role, but Warner Brothers refused to pay him what he was asking for. He wanted a reasonable raise, in my opinion, for what he brought to that franchise. And they decided not to pay him. They went with Val Kilmer, and the rest is history. And yeah, Batman Forever was a huge, massive hit. But I think the Tim Burton Batman 3 would have been financially successful too. It might not have been as marketable, but I think it would have been marketable enough that it still would have made money in terms of merchandising sales. And it just is one of those things where I feel it was a pretty big missed opportunity because Batman Forever in a lot of ways has not aged well. Batman Returns and Batman '89, I think they've held up fairly well over the years, and on a lot of ways, they honestly just kind of keep getting better to me. The more that I revisit them, Forever and Batman and Robin are the complete opposite. So a third Burton Batman film, I think honestly really would have been a better than Forever. Uh, but that's just me personally. I know there's also a Catwoman spinoff, which would have been considerably better than the Halle Berry version that I honestly would have liked to have seen, with Michelle Pfeiffer reprising her role as Catwoman, taking place in the same Burton verse when it comes to his vision of Gotham and his take on the Batman universe. And sticking with Batman, I wish we got a Batman Beyond film. Whether it's in the style of Into the Spider-Verse or a live action film taking place within the Burtonverse. Can you imagine that? A live action Batman Beyond taking place within the Burtonverse, with futuristic gothic architecture in the vein of Anton Furst's Oscar winning production design for Batman '89, and Michael Keaton coming back as old Wayne. Like, I think that would have been great. There's a ton of potential for that. You could cast maybe someone like Austin Butler to play Terry McGinnis. I mean, heck, you could even bring in Timothy Chalamet. Like, he looks the part as well. Um, I always felt that Dylan O'Brien, when he was younger, when he was doing the Maze Runner films, would have been a really good Terry McGinnis in a live action Batman Beyond. But Warner Brothers just didn't decide that that was an idea that they wanted to pursue. And I think it's a mistake. I think Batman Beyond has enough of a fan base that it would do well. And I do remember reading something that the Batgirl film was intended to be maybe a launching point for a Batman Beyond spinoff with Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne, but they scrapped that once Zaslav took over and decided to completely shelve Batgirl and start over when it comes to the future approach for the DC cinematic universe. And that just makes me upset that Batgirl was even greenlit in the first place. Like, I think it's lame that it got shelved and we'll never see the movie due to tax purposes and tax write-off bullshit. But to me, it's an even bigger crime that we didn't get Batman Beyond instead, because it has old Bruce Wayne and there's a new person wearing the cowl, but this time it's Batgirl. I always felt like a weird blend of Batman Beyond and Batgirl, and it felt out of place anyway. So they should have just made the Batman Beyond movie instead. And I think if they did, it probably wouldn't have gotten shelved, and it probably would have done better business than anything that Warner Brothers put out that year in terms of DC comic book films. It would have absolutely destroyed something like Blue Beetle, for instance. Blue Beetle is too niche of a character and has honestly too niche of a fan base to really be that big of a hit. Batman Beyond, it has enough of a fan base that if that was done right and the trailer dropped and it had some jaw-dropping visuals in it, and you see Michael Keaton back as Bruce Wayne, and they see Terry McGinnis in the suit for the first time, the hype would have been through the roof. But DC and Warner Brothers just completely were oblivious of that and just didn't even get it. And what's crazy is Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse from Sony really showed that you could, at least do a comic animated version of it. You could do an animated style take on it. There was even somebody online who did like some spec concept art and even tried to sell it to Warner Brothers. But Warner Brothers was like, yeah, this isn't financially viable at this time. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not financially viable? Like, what are you talking about? Like, that artwork looked incredible, and there were a lot of people online who were like, "This looks great. I want to see this movie." So they just are out of touch, clearly, and it's a damn shame. Um, and we'll more than likely probably never get a Batman Beyond movie. We'll be lucky if we get another Batman Beyond series, like maybe like a spin-off sequel cartoon series or something like the new Batman cartoon that's coming out from Bruce Timm. But yeah, that's a massive missed opportunity for me. The Batman Beyond film when it comes to DC, it's one of the biggest ones for me when it comes to comic book films in general. It's right up there with Hellboy 3. It's like Hellboy 3, Batman Beyond, um, and when it comes to DC as well, I feel honestly a Lobo movie would have been cool and interesting if it was done properly. And it's been like in development hell for many years. Lobo, in a lot of ways, is kind of like DC's Deadpool. So to have a character that breaks the fourth wall like Deadpool, has that kind of irreverent sense of humor, but is also an anti-hero. I think that really would have been interesting. I would have rather seen a Lobo movie than Black Adam, but that's just me personally. When it comes to other DC stuff, I would have loved to have seen in an alternate universe where Christopher Reeve is not paralyzed by the horse riding accident, a Death and Return of Superman two-part epic film. Where you have the first part is the death of Superman. If Christopher Reeve reprised his role as Superman in that and had that battle with Doomsday and died in Lois's arms, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the house. And then you could have like Michael Keaton have a cameo as Batman at the funeral. John Wesley Shipp as the Flash. You could have you could even maybe have Linda Carter come back as Wonder Woman. There's a lot of things that you could have done that would have been really nice callbacks to fans. Um, and I just think that would have been really awesome, really cool with a big budget behind it. Chris Reeve back as Superman after and it's a serious, just slugfest of a film. That's very different to what you saw Christopher Reeve do when it comes to other Superman films at the time, bringing things back to a little bit more serious note in comparison to Superman 3 and 4, and then he dies in the end. But you have like the end after you could like this film could have like done the after credits thing or the mid credits reveal before it became popular, because you would have Superman die at the funeral, and then you'd have like a mid credit scene which shows that, wait a second, he might not actually be dead. Like he's recuperating in this chamber. Okay, what is going on? And then you set things up for the return of Superman. And the way that I would have done it would have been shot back to back. So you would even have like a trailer for the return, like a teaser trailer for the return of Superman after the end credits, like with Back to the Future Part 2, which had the trailer for Back to the Future Part 3. I think if both of those films were done correctly and done the right way, uh, Death of Superman and Return of Superman with Christopher Reeve, in an alternate universe where he is not paralyzed, those films would have been massive hits. So that's something I definitely wish we got to see. But due to Christopher Reeve's accident, like that was something that was never really in the cards. And speaking of Superman, yeah, I admit it, I would have liked to have seen Superman Lives with Nicolas Cage and directed by Tim Burton. Honestly, I wish we got that instead of Batman and Robin. Like, it looked like a crazy movie. It looked like one of those films that it might not have worked. It might have been a train wreck, but man, would it have been a sight to behold. It looked like something that definitely would have been quite the spectacle, for better or worse, and I would have taken that over something like Batman and Robin, or in all honesty, some of these other lame uh, DC comic films that they did instead in the future or around the same time. But they just decided to scrap the project, and all that we have now is a great documentary and some photos of Nicolas Cage in costume, a lot of really wild, nuts uh, storyboards and artwork for the film, as well as some like tests of the suit design that was very ambitious with the electricity and everything, and rumored casting choices in terms of who would have played who, other than Nicolas Cage as Superman. I think there was like Tim Allen or Jim Carrey as Brainiac, and um, a whole bunch of other different cast members, like Chris Rock as Jimmy Olsen. Would have been fun. I think it would have been a fun movie. I genuinely do feel that way. Would have been one of those films where people would be like, "What the hell was up to that giant spider?" And there'd be all these moments where people were like, "What the hell was that?" But I think it still would have been one of those films that would still be pretty entertaining, though. Like, I wish I would have rather have gotten Superman Lives than whatever we got with Superman Returns as well. At least it's trying to be its own thing and not trying to be some kind of pseudo sequel to Superman and Superman 2. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on Superman Lives. But yeah, in terms of any other DC projects, I know there was a Sergeant Rock film that was optioned and even got to the point where there were promotional buttons sent out to people. If you hear if you hear any laughing, my mom is watching a comedy in the background, so she's not really laughing at me. It's just laughing at something on the TV. But the Sergeant Rock film, yeah, it got to the point where there was even like promotional buttons that were given out to people, but it never got made. And it was actually had Arnold Schwarzenegger attached to play Sergeant Rock. So that could have been fun. That definitely could have been an interesting movie. See Schwarzenegger play Sergeant Rock. But really, other than maybe Constantine 2 is another one, because I remember reading about Constantine 2 and how it was potentially going to happen with Keanu Reeves reprising his role as John Constantine, but I haven't heard anything about that since. So that's one I want to see because I think Constantine is one of the more underrated DC films or just comic book films in general. So I would love to see another one with Keanu Reeves reprising his role as John Constantine. But that and maybe another Swamp Thing. I think a Swamp Thing film with a bigger budget behind it, that could be uh, cool. I think that has some serious potential. I think you saw some of that with the Swamp Thing TV show that never got a chance in hell because of the Zaslav situation at Warner Brothers. But it would have been interesting to have seen a live action like feature film with a budget behind it that wasn't like super low budget like Swamp Thing and Return of the Swamp Thing were back in the 80s when those two film adaptations came out. So that's my thoughts on DC when it comes to unmade film projects. Now we move to Marvel, which is the last company that I'm going to focus on when it comes to unmade comic book films. And I'm going to start out with some that were thought of or were in the works or were considered before you even had the MCU. The first one is Black Panther. Wesley Snipes was optioning and trying to get a Black Panther film made, and even actually got Columbia Pictures to agree to finance it and to release the movie in the early 90s. This is before Blade, by the way. And Wesley even had talks with directors like John Singleton, But Singleton's idea was way off the mark. He was trying to make it into a political activist movie with the real Black Panthers, and he was just missing the entire point of the movie. And it ultimately hit a snag, and it just it got shelved entirely. It just could not move forward because they couldn't find a director, and it's a damn shame because I would have loved to have seen that, and I think that honestly would have had potential to be even better than the Black Panther movie that we did get with the late Chadwick Boseman. No offense to Chadwick Boseman, but he does not have the same level of charisma that Wesley Snipes does. But and also Wesley's a real martial artist, so that would have been really cool to have seen the fights. And he wouldn't have the crappy CGI fighting like you had in the actual Black Panther movie. So I think that that could have been really cool. I would have loved to have seen that. Wesley Snipes as Black Panther. Oh, but what would that mean? He wouldn't play Blade? No, he could be Black Panther and Blade. Like Wesley Snipes was so cool and such a versatile actor at that time. He could have played both characters fine. Um, Another one I would have loved to have seen in the '90s is Dolph Lundgren as Venom. I know Dolph Lundgren already played the Punisher in the 1989 film, and that's another one I would have loved to have seen a second Punisher film with Dolph Lundgren. I know there were even posters that were made for it, but it never got made because the company that financed the Punisher from 1989, New World International, completely went under before the Punisher was even finished with post production. So the reason why the Punisher from 1989 never even got a theatrical release in the United States and was just released direct to video is because of New World International and it just completely crumbling. So there was no chance of a sequel happening, but I would have loved to have seen a sequel with Dolph Lundgren's Punisher. Maybe in the sequel he would have a skull on his chest, because he didn't have it in the first film. And I think initially the plan was to have it in the first film, but there were some issues regarding Marvel and Stan Lee and so on and so forth. Because if you get the comic book adaptation of that movie, he spray paints a skull on his armor, so similar to what Thomas Jane did in his Punisher. And speaking of that, I would love to have seen a second Punisher with Thomas Jane. If you look at the short that he did called Dirty Laundry, as Frank Castle, it really shows that he would have nailed it and would have done a great job playing that role again. Honestly, I wish they did Punisher 2 instead of what is it, Warzone? I think that's what it is, or War. I think that's what it is. I haven't seen Punisher, the other Punisher film, in years. So I would have rather seen Thomas Jane do a sequel to his Punisher than whatever that was. But that's just me personally. So the Punisher sequels is definitely something that I think was a missed opportunity when it comes to Marvel, and that's with the Dolph Lundgren Punisher. That's even before the Black Panther movie. I know there was also an Iron Man film that was potentially in the works. Could have been interesting. I know the rumor was Tom Cruise playing Tony Stark at the time. I love Robert Downey Jr., but Tom Cruise in his prime playing Tony Stark, that could have been fun. It genuinely could have been. I know there was an Incredible Hulk film that was pretty far along in the pre-production phase. I think it was going to be in the '90s, and they even had like practical effects, and they were even working on like life-size animatronics, and that I think it hit an issue once Marvel itself was dealing with some financial problems, and that caused some rights issues with Hulk. Or it was one of those things where it was just going to be too expensive to do it the way that they were intending to do it, and the studio didn't want to take that risk. Either way, like you can look up some photos online, they're pretty dang impressive. And I don't remember who was attached to direct. Um, I know it wasn't Ang Lee. Part of me is thinking what Jan de Bont was attached to a Godzilla movie at one point, so I don't think that it was him, but it was a different director. And honestly, it would have been. I would have loved to have seen that. I really would have loved to have seen that Hulk movie. But that's just me personally, because I'm not really a fan of the Ang Lee Hulk film, and I like the Incredible Hulk. And that's another one I would have liked to have seen a sequel to the Incredible Hulk with with Edward Norton reprising his role, because I think he's the best MCU Hulk. I'm sorry, I don't like Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner. I think his Hulk is overrated. And Edward Norton, yeah, he's an ass to deal with on set, but he's a better actor, and he did a better job playing Bruce Banner. So I would have liked to have seen a sequel with more of Edward Norton's Hulk. And honestly, I would have liked to have seen that Hulk incorporated throughout the rest of the MCU. None of the jokey Hulk. That was lame. You turned Hulk into a pathetic joke. I don't think that was needed. Smart Hulk in the comics, when Bruce was the Hulk, but as Smart Hulk, he was comical, but he was honestly genuinely funny. He wasn't, lame. Like there were those runs in the 90s with Smart Hulk as Bruce being Bruce but as the Hulk are honestly my favorite Hulk comics. They remind me in a lot of ways of the Deadpool comics that I read in the 90s. So I was open to the idea of that Hulk being incorporated into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but they just completely botched it. So no, I would have rather them taken a more straightforward, serious approach with Edward Norton than what they ultimately did with the Hulk played by Mark Ruffalo. Um, Now, when it comes to some other Marvel projects, I know there was James Cameron Spider Man. I'm glad that didn't get made though, because that just seemed like a really weird movie. Didn't seem like a good fit. Michael Biehn as Peter Parker is not the right casting. Schwarzenegger as Doctor Octopus might have been okay, but there's just a lot of issues that I have with that overall concept. From what I've read and the storyboards, it just looked like a disaster. And I also did not want to see the Canon Films version either, where it's a man spider movie instead of Spider Man. Um, and didn't want to see Canon Films' Captain America, directed by Michael Winner, because that probably would have sucked just as bad as the actual Captain America movie that people from Canon wound up making with Matt Salinger and his rubber ears in 1990. Although I can have some fun with that film due to nostalgia, and it's a guilty pleasure of mine. That movie sucks. It's bad. Um, and when it comes to MCU stuff, like honestly, there's not really a lot when it comes to unmade MCU films that I really wish uh got made, because a lot of the MCU films that I wanted to see get made already got made. Um, so really for me, it's more stuff outside of the MCU, or stuff that I wish the MCU didn't do. But that's not really the same as an unmade film project that I wish got made. So for me, this is going to be controversial, but I got a couple. Daredevil 2 with Ben Affleck. Daredevil, the 2000, was it 2002, 2003? What is it, 2000, or I forgot exactly when the first Daredevil came out, forgive me, but I know it was after Spider-Man, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and I saw that in the theater, and I loved it. I enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun with it, and to me, it's an underrated film. It's not a movie that's absolutely awful or garbage or trash. I think it gets too much crap, and the director's cut in particular is great. So I would have loved to have seen a sequel to Ben Affleck's Daredevil. Maybe see him fight Typhoid Mary. Maybe you can use that film to bring in Elektra. But instead, they did the Elektra movie, and that was excruciatingly bad. So I think the better option would have been to just make Daredevil 2 instead of do Elektra. It's not like Daredevil did bad financially. It did well financially. It made a significant amount of money, and critically, it wasn't really that hated either at the time. So it's not one of those movies that I feel really deserved not getting a sequel. I wish we got Daredevil 2 instead of Elektra. I wish we had Daredevil 2 instead of Fantastic Four: The Rise of the Silver Surfer, or Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance. Like, you get a sequel to the, Mark Steven Johnson's lesser comic book film and Ghost Rider, but you don't get a sequel to his Daredevil. I just think that that was a mistake. Also, I I'm one of the few people that defends the Amazing Spider-Man 2, even as flawed as it is, and I will still continue to do that because I think that film is genuinely underrated, and it's got problems. It's all over the place. There's too much stuff going on. Needed to trim out a handful of subplots, but what it does right, it excels at, and I think it does better than any Spider-Man MCU appearance that I've seen or film that I've seen to date. I genuinely feel that way, and the way that it left things off with an adult Peter having to deal with adult responsibilities, having to deal with loss and grief, and moving forward from that is a place that I've always wanted to see a Spider-Man film go to, but I never got to see that because instead Disney and they just decided to reboot the entire series, start from scratch, have Peter back to being a high schooler, and it's just been nothing but deja vu since. And also, Iron Spider sucks. I never liked Iron Spider. I don't like Tony Stark Jr. when it comes to Peter Parker or Spider Man. So I think they should have just stuck with Andrew Garfield. Andrew Garfield was young enough at the time. He didn't have to be a teenager. He doesn't have to grow up with the Avengers. He can be a man. He can be an adult along with all the other Avengers and still like crack jokes and stuff. That's Peter's personality. Why did he have to be a kid? Why did he have to be a teenager? He didn't have to do that. You didn't have to make him Tony Stark Jr. You could have just had Andrew Garfield sign on and be a part of the future plans for the MCU. I think he would have been open to that. He genuinely loved playing Spider-Man, and his take and his portrayal as Spidey is the closest I've ever seen to any actor being the Spider-Man that I grew up with in the 90s cartoon, in the 90s comics. So to see that Spider-Man and to see his performance as that character in only 2 films, No Way Home doesn't count because that's just a cameo. It's only 2 films? Lame. I wish we got Amazing Spider-Man 3 instead of a rumored Spider-Man 4 with Tobey Maguire. I don't want to see that. I'd rather see the Amazing Spider-Man 3. I know I'm in the minority on that, but that's honestly how I feel. I think Sony should have just made that movie and then made it a launching point for Spider-Man to be in the MCU. That's just my personal take. I know it's a hot take, but that's how I feel about it. And that's really all I have to say when it comes to Marvel projects because I can't really think of anything else in terms of a Marvel project that got unmade, that wasn't made, that I wish got made. There's ones that I wish were made better, like X-Men 3, The Last Stand, or Dark Phoenix. They had 2 chances to do that storyline justice, and they completely fucked it up both times. So I wish we got that. I wish we. I guess there's one more. I wish we got the Deadpool show, the Deadpool animated show. I wish we actually did get that. I think that would have been fun. I think Deadpool really works well in the realm of animation, like a TVMA animated series. That'd be cool. That'd be awesome. That'd be hilarious. That'd be great. I'd love to see that. But just didn't happen. Wasn't meant to be apparently. But anyway, that's my thoughts on a bunch of unmade comic book films. I know that this is like 40 something minutes. There were a lot of them. There were a lot of unmade comic book films I wanted to mention. There might even be some more that, I could talk about, another time. Just off the top of my head, The Rocketeer 2. Would have loved to have seen more adventures of Cliff Secord in that alternate take on World War II era United States. You know, would have liked to have seen that because The Rocketeer was a good movie, and it was a good launching pad for a franchise. So you could see more and see The Rocketeer do more and see bigger things with that franchise. But the film underperformed, and whatever plans Disney had for a franchise were scrapped after that point. I mean, Bill Campbell and the cast, they signed on for two more films. So Disney initially thought this was going to be a big thing, and it just didn't pan out that way. So I really would have loved to have seen more Rocketeer movies. But other than that, like, I got nothing. If you have any unmade comic book film projects that you would like to discuss down below, feel free to do so. I would love to see your thoughts on this topic. And until the next video, I'll see you later. See ya.